Okay, hello and welcome back to the Sam Beast YouTube channel. My name is David Foxen, and today we have got a webinar all about hardware asset management implementation, aka HAM. So in this webinar, we're going to go through some of the basics, bits of information that you need to start your hardware asset management journey within your organization. I've tried to be really kind of strip it back to the bare bones almost and try and make it relevant for organizations of all different types and sizes and industries, etc. So yeah, hopefully you find it useful. Before we start, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more IT asset management content here on the Sam Beast YouTube channel. So without further ado, let's get started. So let's go through the agenda for today. There's going to be three key areas that we're going to be discussing. The first one is how to build your hardware asset management scope. We look at the different ways in which you can do this through data, criticality, cost, mobility, etc. We're going to look at the hardware ownership versus the governance model for the IT asset management or hardware asset management team, and which one might work well for your organization and your ITAM team. And then finally, we're going to just look at how to build a hardware asset management strategy, key things to consider like a racing matrix, supporting documentation, and then obviously the importance of education and communication when implementing hardware asset management. First of all, let's look at how you should start building your hardware asset management scope. And as you can see from there, we have got a very high-tech asset that we need to manage there on that one. So you can actually break it down into different categories to build your hardware asset management scope. And all of these areas may not be part of your scope from day one. You may want to build up to this as you start your hardware asset management journey. So for example, your focus may initially be on the end user technology side of things. When looking at end user technologies, we're talking about your laptops, desktops, thin clients, monitors, mobile phones, tablets, and any kind of personal printers or scanners that user is going to be using. Kind of does what it says on the tin, right? So these are all end user based assets that you need to be managing. And these are the ones that typically go walkies, go missing, have a lot of repair requirements. You know, the ones that are strictest on managing your hardware refresh process because they're end user technologies is what your organization's customers are using every day to do their jobs, is, you know, what you're paying them to do. So making sure that you have that scope defined is typically what organizations start off doing. Of course, it's different for every organization. Next up, you can also build your ham scope through network assets. Believe it or not, managing network assets from an ITAM and hardware asset management perspective can actually be really fruitful. There's a lot of opportunities in there. There's a lot of ways in which you can add real benefit to your network teams and your organization. And typically the asset types that you manage within the network space are your routers, your firewalls, and your area, your local area connections, or the wider kind of network area connections as well. This is important because a lot of this technology is typically leased as well. If you look at like your Cisco units, for example, you may be on a leasing agreement whereby you're actually only essentially renting those devices and you give them back after a certain period of time. Or if you're buying them, these can end up being really expensive. And some network kit is actually quite flimsy and can break a lot more frequently than you think. And then you've got the whole repairs, replace, etc. So it's really good to get your network assets onboarded as part of your hardware asset management scope as well. We've also obviously got your server and infrastructure. The main two asset types in that are the physical servers themselves and your storage devices. You can, of course, increase that. I've seen organizations look at managing their racks within the asset management database or even managing the cables, etc. This isn't a set in stone scope, you know, it's what works well for you. But just typically your basic kind of asset types that you should have in your scope are your servers and storage from an infrastructure perspective. I've also added on your miscellaneous or your MISC assets. These are kind of like the niche stuff that is unique to your organization. For example, I've been asked to manage drones in IT asset management, hardware asset management. I've been asked to manage like large scale printers, you know, the network printers, which can go absolutely into your hardware asset management scope. There's all sorts of weird and wacky things out there that you can manage through hardware asset management, and it all just depends on the value, the time and the value that it takes to manage those. Is it worth it? That's the only thing I'd say to you. If someone comes to you and says, we want to manage drones or a unique asset type to our organization, we can't get inventory tools on it. It's going to be manually updating in the AMDB. We're going to have to do manual management of it. Is all of that time and effort worth managing an asset that's like $200? That's a decision that you've got to make when you're building your ham scope. Could it actually be treated as a consumable if it's below a set fee? All the kind of decisions that are unique to your organization. But thought I'd add the MISC assets in there as well, so that they don't feel like they're being left out. So there's other ways in which you can build your scope away from the asset types, and the first one is scoping by data. So this is typically where you focus on your data center assets, because that's where they hold a lot of really sensitive and important information for your organization. So therefore, you may have the priority of managing the tin for where all that sensitive data is being stored. This is typically where your data center assets are, of course, things like all of your servers that store your financial information, maybe even pension servers, even just general servers that support critical applications that make your organization run. You may go, okay, that's the key focus for us. That's where we're going to start. We're going to scope our hardware asset management function by where the key data is stored within our organization. It's also important to have a look at this from a long-term view. And when I say a long-term view, I mean, are there any plans to move to the cloud? If you have proactive plans to move to the cloud and away from the physical storage devices, away from the physical servers, etc., it goes back to what I said before, is all of that effort to get all of that equipment into your AMDB, build your process around, is that actually worth it if they're only going to be there for a short period of time? The answer is more than likely to be yes, because you want to manage the physical tin when you move to the cloud. You want to be able to decommission it properly, add all of your ITAD references, etc., which is completely the way that I would go about it personally. But then I'm an ITAM geek. I like things really neat, really tidy, really complete in the AMDB. But if you're a small team and you know that there's movements into the cloud, you physically don't have the capacity, maybe it's time to make a judgment call on whether all of that effort is worth importing all of the server and infrastructure assets into your AMDB if you're moving to the cloud. So again, yeah, there's no one size fits all here. You've got to make an informed decision when you're building out your scope as to what works well for your organization and your ITAM team. You can also scope by business criticality. Now, I'm sure you've heard of this within the ITIL realms, where they build out criticality by tiers. This is really prevalent within the software space in particular, where you're looking at your critical applications that make your organization tick, so that you have all of your processes and controls sorted and managed around that. So in the event that something goes down, your major incident kicks in and you get it rectified as soon as possible, because there's certain actions or certain business processes that physically cannot run. And do that for hardware as well. There's absolutely nothing to stop you following that methodology and that approach. I would again just be careful and mindful of this, that if you're moving between different organizations and you scope your hardware assets by criticality, that the hardware assets that you were critical in a previous organization may not be the same in a new organization, and you quickly realize that one size doesn't fit all when you're implementing hardware asset management. You could, for example, have a really old, creaky server that runs a really critical application for your organization that's fully depreciated. It's got no value left in it, but it does a specific job. The application may be the highest tier that you have, and therefore the corresponding hardware may also be considered the highest tier that you have. I would encourage you to maybe look at trying to move away from said legacy hardware and software. But if you have that within your organization, there's no shame whatsoever in making sure that that's one of your hardware asset types or your hardware assets that are within your scope. So typically when you deviate things by criticality, you're looking at the different tiers. So some organizations start tier 1, some start tier 0. It's by the by, it's whatever your convention is internally. So tier 0 is the most critical one. These are network assets and specific servers that host emergency and that host critical applications, and also emergency static phones. There's a lot of organizations that have emergency static phones on shop floors, production lines, etc. In case something goes wrong, someone gets injured, they can immediately use that phone to ring for help or ring for the emergency services. This is just a default, really critical. These assets don't move around either, so they're really easy to manage from an asset management database perspective. But then when you've got that data and that intelligence in your AMDB, you can build reports and you provide really valuable feedback to your stakeholders that maybe you're doing a hardware refresh on those phones or would like to know how many phones are per floor, etc. You've then got your tier ones, which is typically your remaining server data center assets. And if you're in retail, like point of sale devices go down. How are you selling stuff? Names in the names in the title of what they do and how important they are. Tier two, typically audio visual conference room stuff. Again, if you're customer facing, if you need to do a meeting and your AV goes down, that's not great. So that's typically a tier two. Tier three is typically your network printers that a lot of your end users are connecting to be able to print stuff. Because it still happens, people still print everything. Not everything's digital at the moment. You got your VoIP phones, your information screens and TVs. You probably walk around a lot of departments and you can see dashboards on how long people have been waiting on a phone call, or critical systems like alerts and stuff like that. That typically goes into your T3, and you start to reach the hierarchy structure and the C-level end user technology assets. So your C-level, your board, your VIPs, however you define them, their assets are typically tier 3. They get higher priority than your average Joe. Sorry to anyone called Joe. Your average Joe, bless them, in marketing or finance, who's just got their a standard laptop. Tier 4 then is your desktop, laptops, mobile phones and tablets, the rest of the end user technologies. Some organizations do move laptops higher up the chain because it's the bread and butter for your end users. Again, judgment call based on you, but typically this is what we see when scoping hardware assets by business criticality. And then finally, we've got the standalone printers, handheld scanners for asset tagging and consumables as well. I don't typically include consumables within my hardware asset management scope. I typically put the emphasis and responsibility on the local tech supports, for example, the local service desks to manage headsets, mice, keyboards, etc. Because with the greatest of respect, IT asset management needs to be focusing its attention on your critical and your actual hardware assets rather than your consumables. But again, consumables may be within your scope. There's a lot of manual inventory to be doing on that one. It can be a pain, but once you do all the legwork and you've got a process in place to monitor how many keyboards you've got in stock, how many mice, etc., then by all means, there's nothing stopping you managing it from a hardware asset management point of view or in your AMDB. It's just not my cup of tea, to be honest with you. You can then look at scoping your hardware assets by financials. So what are the most expensive IT asset types based on your total cost of ownership? So this is including the purchase of the physical hardware, any support and maintenance, any long-term costs to keep that equipment going. How much does that asset cost you through your internal life cycle? And like I said, really important to make sure you factor in the support costs in this, because something that may be quite cheap to purchase outright actually you have to buy maintenance for it, and that maintenance cost can times 3 times 4 the actual overall cost. So while it looks great on the initial purchase and implementation, longer term to keep the kit running is actually cost quite a bit of money. Work with your fixed asset team to understand the depreciation thresholds. How are they depreciating IT equipment compared to how you are within your asset management database? We talk about depreciation models in another webinar as we start to mature hardware asset management, but typically you're looking at 3 years for your end user assets. 2 years maybe for phones is typical 2-year life cycle for mobile phones, and then 5 to 7 years for your desktops, your servers, your switches, etc. The financials may also include those one-off niche assets that we mentioned before that are not typically part of a ham scope, but a huge cost. So you want to make sure that they're within the scope. Please make sure that you're populating your asset management database with the financial information so that you can identify the total cost of ownership of that asset throughout its life cycle, so that you can build your scope via your most valuable financially IT assets. And finally, another option for building out your scope is by mobility. So assets that move around a lot and can be lost really easily. These are typically your laptops, your iPads, your iPhones, your tablets, your mobile phones, etc. Yeah, they move around a lot. They get lost a lot. They end up down the back of a sofa for phones, and users don't know where they are. And yeah, these may contain or have access to sensitive and critical data, and data is king. So if you lose a mobile phone or a laptop on a train or public transport, and your asset tag shows exactly what your company is, and an opportunist person out there tries to get into it, they may have access to the OneDrive of that device, the local file stored on that device. So you may want to look at scoping your hardware asset management scope by how mobile these kind of assets are. Point of sale devices as well for retail organizations are a big one in this, because they get lost so often. And again, it's that customer experience. If you don't know where your point of sale devices are and you're trying to make a sale, and I don't know if you go around shops now as well, there are salespeople that walk around with point of sale devices there, so that wherever there's no till, you just go up to them. They've got like an iPad on a point of sale device or an iPhone or whatever, and you can do it there and then without having going up to a till. So it's really embarrassing from a retail perspective if you don't know where they are, because you keep losing them. So yeah, it might be worth adding any point of sale devices into your scope early doors if you're a retail organization. These devices get lost and damaged way more easily, so I highly recommend that you understand the parameters of your warranty that you have, whether it's standard warranty, extended warranty, and any support contracts around that, so that you know what the replacement and repairs process is from that. And these assets typically have a higher rate of hardware refresh than static assets. So getting these in your hardware asset management scope early on means that you can start being way more proactive and maturing your hardware asset management function by building those hardware refresh cycles, and building the budget planning for years to come, for years and years to come, which again, when you're ITAM and you provide those kind of reports to senior management, you look good. You look really good. You look like you're in control. You know what you're doing. And especially, for things that have a high refresh rate, it's really great to be able to map out in 2 years, we need to invest this much, 3 years, this much, 4 years, 5 years, etc. That really gets stakeholders and senior stakeholders on board. So scoping by mobility is another highly recommended path. They all are, to be fair. Just make sure you're building your scope. Don't just leave it to, thinking that that's in scope, or assuming that, like, really detail it, get it written down in your policies. So getting the right ham scope, making sure you're getting that senior management support and buy-in. If they don't support it, it's going to be an uphill battle really early on. So you may present a draft scope to senior management and they go, like it, but I don't agree with this, and this asset type being in there. And actually, I really want you to manage this asset type within the scope from straight off the bat. So make sure you involve your senior management, get their support, get their sign off. Then you can move down to the IT asset type owner, and we'll discuss more about your IT asset type owners in a second. Make sure that they support the scope, ITAM support it. Your newly formed ham scope into your existing hardware asset management policy and processes. If you don't have any policy and processes, great, because you can build around your hardware asset management scope, which is almost easier than trying to incorporate your new scope into an existing policy and processes. So yeah, I would prefer to build the scope first and then build the policy and processes. But you haven't got that luxury. Make sure that you're updating your policy and processes to cover how you're going to manage the life cycle processes of the asset types that you've just added into your scope. And finally, once your scope has been agreed and defined, make sure you do a roles and responsibilities matrix, aka a racing matrix, which we'll go over again. Host webinars, deep dive sessions, make the world aware of your hardware asset management scope, how you're going to manage them, what processes and policies you've got in place. I firmly believe there's no such thing as over communication. So if you need to have weekly webinars, have bi-weekly webinars, have 2 webinars a week, 3, whatever it takes, make sure that you're getting your message out to as many of the key stakeholders that you can, that, hey guys, these asset types are now under the scope of IT asset management or hardware asset management. Here's how we're going to manage them moving forward. Here are our IT asset type owners. this is what we're doing moving forward. I feel like if you do all of that over communicating, then you're bound to eventually reach everyone. Make sure you've got links to your SharePoint pages where all of the information can be read, and record your sessions as well. If you're doing webinars about your hardware asset management scope, record them, put them on demand. People may not watch them, but at least you've got that there so you can point people to it when they start asking you why you're not managing consumables, or can you start logging the serial numbers for all the headsets within your organization. So let's recap then on the scope. It all depends on your ham requirements. There is no drag and drop, one size fits all. It's unique to your organization what your requirements are. But some of the basic IT asset types are pretty obvious out there. Core assets should be your desktops, laptops, mobiles, tablets, servers, switches, firewalls, routers, and expensive printers. That's really an easy foundation to start your ham scope. Nothing's off limits. Hardware asset management could manage it. Even if that's manual, you can do it. So ensure that any of your asset types within scope have existing data sets or inventory technologies. Goes back to, is the manual effort really worth it? Might not be. If it's got an inventory tool, absolutely will manage it. Really fantastic. Let's build APIs into our AMDB. Let's get all that data in there. We'll be more than happy to manage it. And finally, communicate with your key stakeholders about what IT asset types are within your scope and what is being managed. So that's the hardware asset management scope. Now let's move over to how you're going to manage your new scope and hardware assets. There's a big debate within a lot of organizations, and in particularly clients when they want to implement hardware asset management, is do they want to do ownership or governance? And they're two very different things. So hardware asset ownership is when IT asset management has full control and responsibilities for all elements of hardware asset management. They're responsible for the governance and the day-to-day controls and processes, responsible for all of the IT asset type strategies, finances, lifecycle management, day-to-day hardware requests, and they're basically, ITAM is the one-stop shop for anything related to that hardware asset. That's quite a big task and a big challenge. It gives you more control and it gives you a bigger say, but if you're a smaller team, it may not be the right option for you. So there are obviously pros and cons to everything in life. The pros for hardware asset ownership are full control. ITAM owns everything. You're able to set the strategy, define the refresh cycles. You're responsible for managing the hardware budget, risk reporting, and mitigation plans. I put those as pros because, again, that's where IT asset management can really show the value that it's bringing and really add that extra level of support and service. The cons is a lot of resource and a lot of time to manage this for all IT asset types across the board on a day-to-day basis. There's a big task because if you're responsible for all IT asset types, and you could end up with the responsibility of those pesky consumables as well, because you're doing such a great job. You've got so much control over the asset types, you may end up with consumables. Now, we've mentioned a few times referenced IT asset type owners, but what exactly are they? Now, these are almost an extension of your IT asset management team, an unofficial extension. These are subject matter experts for a particular IT asset type. They're responsible for the day-to-day management and ownership of IT assets for that specific type, responsible for supporting the ITAM team on the hardware asset management strategy, responsible for updating the AMDB, and they can also be responsible for the financial management and budget planning and hardware refresh for their particular asset type. It's very similar to software champions. If you have that within your software asset management space, you've got key contacts within your organization who know everything there is to know about an application. They know the licensing, they've got the relationship. It's very similar to that. So examples of IT asset type owners. So you could have your end user teams responsible for all the end user assets, data center and infra responsible for all your data center assets, network asset. It is what it is, right? It says what it does, says on the screen. And I think if you need an example of this to take within your organization, please feel free to screen grab this and take it away and see how you can map your current key stakeholders to being an IT asset type owner for particular asset types within your organization. There, of course, again, if you've got those niche asset types, they're typically business stakeholders that aren't maybe not even in IT, that again use that equipment on a day-to-day basis or are responsible for its ad hoc usage, etc. So get those people involved as well. On the flip side of that, you've got governance, hardware asset governance. Now, this could be a better fit for you if you've got a smaller team, if you're just implementing hardware asset management. This is where the IT asset type owners are actually responsible for that day-to-day management, following the controls and the processes. They're responsible for setting and delivering the strategy for their asset types. They're responsible for updating the AIMDB and CMDB for their asset types. They're held accountable for their BAU documentation and controls by ITAM. So ITAM almost audits their processes and controls for managing their IT asset types to make sure it's aligned with what you want as an IT asset management professional and stakeholder. They run the governance reports, checks of data, processes and ways of working for their asset type. Now, ITAM in this instance will not own the IT asset types. They don't have the responsibility for the physical management of the assets. It may even be that it goes so far as you don't even update the AMDB, you don't even audit their processes, just completely out of scope. But I would always recommend having as much in scope as you can. And if you've got a smaller team, delegating this out to other stakeholders to support you, and at least having some sort of visibility and some sort of control around these IT asset types. And like I said before, these guys and girls are just an extension of your IT asset management team, unofficially, but they are an extension, very much like your software champions would be. Again, if you want to see the differences or you want to take this internally, please feel free to screen grab these slides and take it to your senior management to say, look, I think we should be an ITAM governance function, here's why, or I think we should be an ownership function and here's why as well. Hopefully these slides will kind of give you some foundation and basis to make that decision. There are, of course, some pros and cons to this. Pros, less time and resources needed to manage these. It becomes a group effort and a group responsibility rather than just on the ITAM. There's less finger pointing. You can focus more on the HAM maturity or ITAM maturity, building the governance processes, controls, work instructions, video guides, whatever it may be. You can also focus on longer term strategy, hardware refresh plans, whatever you need to focus on. This kind of gives you that free time to be able to do more ITAM and HAM high level stuff. And of course, you then get that high level view of the whole estate, so you can review optimization opportunities because your IT asset type owners are taking over the ownership and the controls of building out the processes and updating AMDB and the CMDB. The cons are you have less influence and control on the daily activities. So for me, that's something I really struggle to do. I understand why I need to be able to let go. I still feel like I need that control to be able to validate the justification if we're doing a refresh, if we're buying new equipment for something that I'm not an owner of. I'm an asset. I leave that to the IT asset type owners. I still want to have visibility and get involved in understanding why they're doing a hardware refresh, why they're buying a different model type than what's in a hardware convention. So yeah, it may be a mix of both governance and ownership. You may feel like you need to do that if you're not fully trying to be diplomatic here, if you're not fully confident yet in the processes and policies your IT asset type owners have created. But yeah, it's an interesting one. There's a balance. You could either be a full owner, or follow the full governance model, or you can mix and match, take bits from each bit that works well for your organization. And I think finally, yes, something that is well worth mentioning, because I've seen it happen in organizations before, is if you do the governance function, use your IT asset type owners, and you start to look at optimization, there can be clashes and conflicts on savings opportunities. Who can claim the savings? Is it ITAM, or is it the cost center that the IT asset type owner is responsible for? You lose out on some potential cost savings if you follow the governance mantra 100%. And of course, you don't have any authority to physically make the IT asset type owners rectify any gap in their process or governance models, because you don't own the asset types, you don't pay for them, you don't buy them. So I like a blend, a mixture, a hybrid, if you like, of governance and ownership. I like being really kind of focused on getting all the processes and controls for all asset types from an ITAM point of view, but then letting the IT asset type owners run those processes and having, monthly calls with the IT asset type owners. What's been happening? What's the plan for the next month? What do we need to do a hardware refresh from? What do we need to extend or support the maintenance agreements for, etc. So there is a nice balance you can have between ownership and governance. But yeah, it all comes down to money at the end of the day. If you're not the budget type, if you're not the budget owner for that particular IT asset type, it's hard for you to start telling people what they shouldn't be doing, because ultimately they just turn around and say, yeah, but it's our budget, we buy it, who cares if we want to buy this new model, who cares if we want to buy more, it doesn't impact you. And that's quite a hard argument to go against. So that's where, yeah, I prefer to have a central budget, a central pool, and then use IT asset type owners to do some of the governance for me. So how to establish the best option for you? We've mentioned about the size and bandwidth of your ITAM team. If you're a one-person team, this is a fantastic option to be able to get stuff done at a quicker rate than you doing everything yourself. Have a look at what the existing ways of working are. Are key stakeholders already responsible for particular IT asset types? If they're not, are they going to be reciprocative to being given this new responsibility of being an IT asset type owner? Who knows? It depends on stakeholder to stakeholder. Some would love to have that extra responsibility. Some wouldn't, because it's not in their job description. How is the current accuracy of your asset management database, your AMDB? Another interesting one. If it's horrendously bad for your certain asset types, maybe it's not the time to then go and get an IT asset type owner to go and fix all of that. Maybe it's time for ITAM to fix that and then move to a governance model. And you can also then add even hardware champions to manage the workload. So typically I ask the IT asset type owners to nominate a hardware champion. These are the kind of the people that are maybe in the IT asset owners team, for example, like a particular stakeholder who we can, work with on a day-to-day basis with any daily requests that come in, with any break fix, with any, needing to procure more of that asset type. So yeah, there's no one size fits all. There's no right answer to this. It's what works best for you, your ITAM team, and your organization. So let's do a quick recap then. Ownership means ITAM has full responsibility. Governance is you're almost outsourcing that to your IT asset type owners. Governance is responsible for running the day-to-day, running data, processes, controls, and all of that exciting stuff. Really think about the bandwidth of your team and what your objectives are for ITAM. Is owning all of the asset types going to help you not achieve your roadmap for this year and your strategy, or will it help you achieve that? Make sure that you have a look into that, and make sure you've got a RACI matrix. We'll discuss that in a second, but make sure you've got a RACI matrix so that everyone knows what they're meant to be doing. The IT asset type owners, ITAM, hardware champions, whatever your definition is. Yeah, make sure you've got all of those controls and RACI matrix in place. So there's no ambiguity. It's all clear. It's all concise. Everyone knows what they need to be doing. So let's look at education and communication. I'm big on this, as you already know. So first things first, a RACI matrix. If you're not familiar with a RACI matrix, it's broken down. It's an acronym, basically. It's broken down by 4 key components. The first of all is who is responsible. Which stakeholders are responsible for performing specific tasks and actions within your hardware lifecycle management process? Who is accountable for ensuring that task is completed correctly? This is typically the IT asset type owners or ITAM if you own all of the assets. Who's consulted when you're making decisions or doing a task or a process? This could be extra advice or an SME giving you advice, extra data sets or extra advice, or a different set of eyes on something that you're working on. Finally, the I is informed. So which stakeholders need to be informed of certain actions that are taken during a task or process? For example, this could be you in IT asset management if you're doing the governance model where an IT asset type owner is making a change, doing a renewal for support, buying a new equipment. You as the ITAM team need to be informed of that, or informed of any AMDB updates or changes that they're making. So when building out a RACI matrix, it's really important that when you're building this out that you list each step that you're taking. So for example, when you build out your processes, it's really good to number the blocks that you have within your process, that you can build a racing matrix that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is the action. This is who's responsible. This is who's accountable. This is who's consulted. This is who's informed. We'll do more about racing matrices in another webinar, but this hopefully gives you an overview. And these are so important when building your ham scope, when building that initial basic implementation of hardware asset management. Like I said, it removes any ambiguity, makes everyone aware of what their responsibilities are, makes everyone aware of what their responsibilities are. Education as well, I'm huge on this as well. So make sure that you're writing blogs for your internal intranet or SharePoint page. Make them fun and engaging, make them relatable. Don't use loads of ITAM terminology because that will make people switch off. But yeah, make them relatable, make them, really interesting, get people to, read them, get it out in a newsletter if you've got a departmental or a wider organization newsletter. Get that message across. Webinars, as I said earlier in this session, make sure that you're almost over communicating, recording those webinars. You can target specific stakeholder and stakeholder groups. You can do it to everyone. You can do it an open door policy, whatever the case may be. Make sure you're getting it in there, making sure you do your webinars and also your deep dive sessions. Deep dives, I tend to do more of a personal webinar, typically aimed at set teams, set stakeholders, set groups. So for example, the service desk are primarily focused on end user assets. So I'll tailor a deep dive session around our hardware asset management scope for end user technologies, our processes and how we're implementing ham in that space, just so it keeps them more engaged, makes them more interested, makes it more relatable to their day-to-day jobs and what they're responsible for. And finally, I always encourage one-to-one sessions with your IT asset type owners and your hardware champions, so you can make it even more personable. You can really build that relationship and that trust between you. And just so that, they may have questions that they didn't want to ask in a webinar because they may fear that it's a really easy, obvious question. They don't want to ask it in front of, tens or hundreds of people on a webinar. They'd rather ask you one-to-one. So build those one-to-one sessions as well, so you can build that relationship, make sure they're fully aware of what you're implementing from a ham perspective, and build that relationship up as well. It's really important to get that message out there. This is just kind of a summary here. Make sure that you're really doing anything that you can to get the hardware asset management or ITAM information out there. Make sure that you're detailing everything, you're recording it, you're writing it, whatever the case may be. Over communicate, don't under communicate. Don't assume that everyone's taking the information on board. Don't assume that everyone joined the webinar. Keep pushing that message out. Keep sharing the links for your intranet page. Keep sharing the links for any blogs or videos that you do. Even work with your internal comms teams. If you've got an internal communication team within IT or the wider business, go and speak to them. They're going to have some great ways in which that you can reach a wider audience, and how best your organization, gets, a high percentage of participation in those kind of sessions. So I really hope that you found this useful. We've covered a lot of the basics when implementing hardware asset management, from building out your scope, getting people aware of what hardware asset management is and your hardware asset management scope and the life cycle, etc. So yeah, just a little conclusion slide. Again, please feel free to screen grab this. It might give you some good ideas moving forward when you're trying to implement your hardware asset management function, or even if you're actually building your scope. You've already got your core scope defined, but you're actually adding on and building that. You can use a lot of the approaches that we've mentioned today in doing that for different and new IT asset types within your organization. So what's happening next here on the Sam Beast YouTube channel? So we've got a webinar coming up, which is the presentation that I'll be doing at the BCS ITAM event that's happening in London in October. So we've also got a recording of that. That's about how artificial intelligence really can help with your ITAM processes. We've got some webinars around basic ham policies and processes, more kind of building upon this ham webinar series. We're building on that with strategy, lifecycle management. We've got an ITAD, ham technologies and what you should look for, building a hardware refresh plan. We then start to look at even more mature things like ham and green IT and sustainability, and also hardware asset management maturity explained. That concludes today's webinar. I really hope you found it useful. Thank you for sticking with it. If you've made it to the end, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more ITAM content. We've got a big back catalogue of hardware, software, FinOps, cloud, ITAM related videos here on the channel. Feel free to go and have a look through those. Otherwise, I hope you found it useful, and we shall see you next time here at the Sam Beast YouTube channel. Happy ITAMing.